Hello everyone, and welcome. With the release of the game, it is finally time to go back and update the tier lists, because a lot has changed about these cultures. We are going to be starting, of course, with the Ancient Era. There will be a separate video for each one of these, and if you've watched my beta tier list, you'll know that these can get quite long, so buckle up, get some popcorn or something, and enjoy the show. Before we get into the cultures, let's talk about a couple items. So first, what defines each tier? Obviously, we need a definition before we can tier any of these things. So an S-tier culture is going to be a culture that is really just excellent in every situation, and it is considerably better than other cultures in at least one area. Alternatively, a culture that is S-tier can have situational bonuses, but when the conditions are met, you can basically win the game just in those situations. An A-tier culture is going to be a culture that is always a good choice, even if it may not be the best every single time that you pick it. Alternatively, a culture that meets the first part of the S-tier definition, but only in specific situations rather than all situations, can be an A-tier culture. B will be a relatively consistent culture that is a decent choice in most situations and may be very good in some scenarios. C-tier cultures are cultures that can do decently given specific circumstances, but those circumstances may be rare or difficult for the player to create for themselves. An example of this is Phoenicians that rely on the map generation to provide them with good harbor locations. So outside those circumstances, the culture is going to struggle, and you should probably take another pick if it's available. A D-tier culture is going to be a culture that will struggle in every scenario or is strictly inferior to another culture in every area. And we'll find a few of these, so it's still relevant. A few considerations for tiering. There are some considerations outside of this, but these are the main 10. First is how well can that culture generate its primary era stars. So your primary era stars are the ones associated with your affinity. When you pick a given affinity, the era star requirements for that era star are increased, but you also generate additional fame for getting those era stars. So it makes them more important than the other era stars in your given era. Second is how well can the culture generate other era stars. Obviously, this is important as well. You don't want to leave any fame on the table, so the more era stars you're able to cultivate throughout the game, the better. 3, 4, and 5 are fundamentally asking how impactful are the unique things that the culture gets: the emblematic quarter, the emblematic unit, and the legacy trait. 6, how well do the culture's bonuses scale into later eras or combine with other cultures? So basically, what's the scaling effect of the culture? Is it only useful in the era that you get it, or does it continue to impact your gameplay throughout the game? If it's only impacting you in the era in which you get it, it needs to be better. Whereas one that scales, you can get away with having a less effective bonus from the moment you get it if it's more effective down the road. 7, how strong is the culture relative to other cultures in the same era? If you can pick a culture that's giving you plus 10% science, but there's another culture that's giving you plus 70% industry or something ridiculous, right? That's not even remotely comparable. So you have to consider not only is the bonus itself worth having, but is it worth having over all the other options available in that era? 8, how well does the culture enable you to perform a strategy other cultures cannot? Certain cultures open up particular strategies that are not available to other cultures. Scientists in particular are really good at this because of their ability to research into the next era, so they get access to a lot of things very early. 9, how strong is the culture's affinity? Each affinity has some different things that it can do, and those things can be strong, they can be weak, they can have varying effects kind of in different eras in terms of how effective they are. So how strong the culture's affinity is and how difficult or easy it is to generate those era stars are also a factor. And finally, how well does the culture take advantage of its affinity? Things that synergize well with the affinity or having different aspects of the culture that allow it to generate the era stars or that allow it to make better use of the affinity's active ability are going to be better than cultures that don't do those things. Finally, a couple abbreviations. CS is combat strength, so just how strong your units are. EQ, or ED, is your emblematic quarter / emblematic districts. This was actually changed. It used to be quarters, now it's districts, talking about the same thing. EU is emblematic unit. Fims, some people also call this Fimsy with an I on the end for influence, but I prefer this abbreviation because I refer to all of them in most situations. So this is food, industry, influence, money, and science, so the core outputs of your civilization, and stab is stability. So let's get right into this with the Assyrians. And the Assyrians are an expansionist, and they have the legacy trait +1 land movement speed on unit, and +5 combat strength bonus when ransacking. So my feelings have changed slightly on land movement speed since the beta. I do like it a bit more now that I've actually seen how maps generate, and the ability of an Assyrian army to move around the map more effectively than their counterparts. And now that there are some other land movement speed options available, for instance the Tenet that also gives some land movement speed, you can really get like Sonic the Hedgehog levels of move speed on some of your armies. And this land movement speed is just going to allow you to attack other cultures more efficiently, move units into defensive formations more efficiently, and take advantage of certain tactical opportunities in combat as well. And I think the main thing that's caused me to reevaluate the value of this +1 land movement speed is really the size of the map and distance between empires. Now that I see how the map is generated and that distance between empires is usually kind of sizable, where it didn't always feel like that in the pre-generated maps that we had prior to release, the +1 land movement speed feels quite a bit more valuable. Now, they also get this +5 combat strength bonus when ransacking, and this really synergizes with their raider unit, their emblematic unit that they get. And this allows them to run around and ransack outposts really efficiently and place down an outpost of their own. It's pretty simple, but it can be quite effective, particularly since the Assyrian raiders have fairly high combat strength, particularly for being in the tech tree in the position they're at. It's one of the very first techs you can unlock. So they have 21 combat strength. We'll get more into that later. But you have an army of those, and they can ransack pretty much anything in one turn. They're very efficient. And in the early eras, that's really good because outposts are usually not going to be attached, not most of the outposts. So you don't have to declare war in order to go ransacking outposts that are not attached. So you can run in, you can ransack in one turn, and you can contain other players while also settling outposts of your own. So this trait, it's really good in the era in which you get it. The land movement speed will continue to be useful. The bonus combat strength when ransacking, it's still kind of useful in classical, but by medieval, you're not going to be making a lot of use of this anymore. So that part of it doesn't really scale very well because it's way more efficient to just run in and take cities than it is to try to pillage a bunch of stuff. So good when you get it, though, particularly when combined with the emblematic unit. So let's talk about the biggest change to the Assyrians, which is the Dunu. So the Dunu used to be pretty crap, but now there's been a couple major changes that actually make it pretty good. First is +2 influence. The Dunu gives you +2 influence. It doesn't seem like a lot, but it combines with the ideology that gives you extra influence on emblematic quarters. So if you get to the first tier of that, the Dunu is suddenly providing +4 influence. And you can do that by selecting the professional army civic that you can get fairly early in the game. Additionally, the Dunu can be purchased on outposts using influence, so you don't need to build this thing. You can build it in all the outposts that you have not attached to your territories. What this means is that the Assyrians go out and they take some time to get rolling, but as they get the Dunus online, they start generating really high amounts of influence, because they can buy these out in every single one of the territories that they own. You effectively get to the point where you can be purchasing a Dunu or an extractor or settling an outpost every single turn. And it doesn't take too long to get to that point. So the Assyrians have a bit of a slower start in that regard. And as a result, between their legacy traits and this somewhat slower but ultimately more effective influence generation, the Assyrians really benefit from actually being really far away from other people so that they can go out and claim a ton of land and get their influence generation rolling before other people have the chance to move in on that land. Now, the Assyrians, they can be effective in combat with the Assyrian raiders, but, spearmen do come out pretty quickly in the ancient era, so keep that in mind. But the Dunu really enables this very heavy, actually peaceful expansionist style of play. But when the Assyrians encounter other people, thanks to their legacy trait and emblematic unit, they're able to effectively hem people in, at least in the early part of the game. So the Dunu is really the cornerstone of the Assyrian strategy at the start. Really where the Assyrians shine because of the Dunu is on maps like Pangaea or any other map that has a really high percentage of land, because it means you're starting farther away from other people, where you can take advantage of your extra movement, you can take advantage of your initially slow but ultimately very good influence generation to claim way more territories than other people are able to, get your other cities online, and all that kind of stuff. It also allows you to secure strategic resources and luxury resources earlier. Thanks to your influence, you can seek out those specific territories, and luxuries are very, very important. They will give you a ton of extra outputs, so you have an advantage in that category as well. So let's talk about the Assyrian Raider, which is the emblematic unit. So they are a cavalry unit, so they unlock at the very first tech. They replace the Scout Rider, if I'm not mistaken. And they have this pillager trait, which generates plus 10% money per pillager unit in the ransacking army when they're destroying an outpost or independent camp. I believe there's a bug with this that it also applies to like admin centers as well, but I'm going to take this at face value. They have 21 combat strength, which is really quite strong. You'll beat out warriors with this. Obviously, you'll beat archers, that kind of stuff. And so they're really quite effective, thanks to their high movement, which is really 7, thanks to the Assyrians' legacy trait. They can move around the map very quickly. They can run in with their high combat strength and the legacy traits for pillaging and quickly destroy an enemy outpost that isn't attached yet. And then you use the Assyrians' influence generation to plop down an outpost of your own. But additionally, because the Assyrians are expansionists, it means you can trespass an enemy territory, so you can go in and use the expansionist active ability with these Assyrian raiders. You quickly run in and you grab an admin center, and then you run back out again. So really the change to the Dunu has enabled the Assyrians to actually be effective, because they actually have ways of claiming outposts and not just destroying other people's outposts. And the raiders play into that strategy with their high mobility and with their ability to pillage extremely effectively. And this might make you think that you want to pick the Assyrians when there are a lot of nearby people, but the reality is that, right, the Assyrian raiders can't siege, they can't attack into a city. You don't have any benefits really to fighting siege battles. You have to rely on archers and warriors just like everyone else, or spearmen, depending on your situation. So effectively, you really want to have access to a lot of territory. And if you're on a smaller map that doesn't have as much territory, or you've spawned very close to some other players, you're not going to be able to take advantage of all the benefits that the Assyrians provide. So where did I put the Assyrians ultimately? I put them in B tier. And I put them in B tier because in the situations in which they are effective, there is no one better at doing what they're doing, which is claiming basically as many territories as possible and getting cities online extremely fast. Because they can really snowball their influence generation with the Dunu and with the ideology to increase the Dunu's influence output, they can generate a ton of influence, and they're able to get Estate era stars. Where they fall down a bit is outside of those situations, they're not as good of a pick. The expansionist era stars in particular are a real headache because the requirements for them are way too high in the ancient era. So it's hard to get your primary era star, and the Assyrians don't have benefits to any other outputs. But because they're able to claim so many outposts in the ancient era, particularly in maps with a high amount of land, it means they have access to more luxuries and strategics. It means they have more outposts attached, more cities, all that kind of stuff. So they're able to get their early game set up in terms of having a really high amount of territory that then they can use to snowball other advantages in the next era. So Assyrians for me land solidly into B. I didn't see another spot for them. I think A was both too high and C was definitely too low. And current state of the game, I think a B tier is an appropriate position for the Assyrians. So next, let's talk about the Babylonians. So the Babylonians get the legacy trait, +2 science per research technology on capital. And of course, they are a scientist culture, so they can research into the next era, and they can turn on a science mode to basically convert all their production and gold into science. You probably won't do that in the Ancients because you really need that production, but the option is there. So +2 science per research technologies on capital is basically only relevant in the Ancient and maybe a little bit into the Classical. By the time you get beyond that, the costs of technologies scale so much that this little bit of extra science really doesn't make that much of a difference. And particularly since every technology increases in cost for every other technology you've already researched, like, yeah, this is going to help you get some of your ancient era techs, basically, right? Once you research a few techs in the era, your next few techs will go faster. But beyond the ancient era, this isn't going to provide you much of a benefit. And honestly, that's totally fine. The Babylonians are able to get ahead on some of the ancient era techs a little bit faster than everyone else, get access to units or strategics or infrastructure before some other players, and this serves its purpose. It's not amazing, but it's fine. So let's talk about the cornerstone of the Babylonians, which is the astronomy house. So the astronomy house is basically a combined research and farmer's quarter. So it exploits food and science from below and adjacent tiles. And I think most importantly, it gives +1 food and +1 science per researcher. There is +3 science per adjacent farmer's quarter. That'll come up every once in a while, but it's not that big of a deal. The real kicker here is the +1 food and +1 science per researcher. You'll likely stack several of these in your capital city. You might have 3, maybe even 4, which dramatically increases the efficiency of researchers and combines nicely because you want as many researchers as possible with the Babylonians, but they're also helping support themselves with food, which keeps your growth higher, which means you can have even more researchers. So the astronomy house actually scales quite well throughout the game. It's very likely that if you pick the Babylonians in the ancient era, you're going to specialize your capital into being science because of the efficiency of the researchers of the Babylonians compared to other cultures. And the astronomy house and the Babylonians legacy trait and all that means you can pretty reliably get into the classical era techs quite early. It enables things very effectively like a swordsman rush and allows you to see iron on the map. So the Babylonians are probably the most effective culture that you can pick and then like go into the Romans because of their ability to see iron early and their ability to get ahead in technology. So the Babylonians have a lot of versatility in that regard because of their ability to get their science output online with the astronomy house. But the astronomy house does take a while to get rolling. You need multiple of them to really be effective. And you're sacrificing things like production in order to get your astronomy house online. And this +3 science per adjacent farmer's quarter, I mean, farmer's quarters aren't that effective early in the game. So you're probably not going to take advantage of that adjacency very often. So the Babylonians are likely to have lower production output for the benefit of extra science. So in my opinion, the Babylonians kind of end up in a spot a little similar to the Assyrians, where they're better when they're isolated from people, where they can take time to get their basic structures up and running, particularly the astronomy house, and go unharassed by other players. And then once they've gotten some of the core techs earlier than other players, then they're really able to be much more effective and start ramping up their production output and all their units and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, the Babylonian astronomy house, it's good. It just takes a while to get rolling. And that speed can matter sometimes. So particularly if you're in a situation where you're really close to other players, it makes it hard to take advantage of what Babylon offers because the AI just love to rush you. So you're going to struggle to get your astronomy house online and balance having your military and having all the scientists that you want. So let's talk about the emblematic unit, which is actually quite good. I don't know how to pronounce this, something like Sabusakesti or something like that. It's basically a spearman replacement. On the wiki, it has anti-cavalry receiving a bonus combat strength of +5. This is actually +8 now. It also has guardian, so it's It gets +3 when it's on a friendly district, as well as a base combat strength of 22, and it only requires 1 copper. You'll notice it has 180 production cost, which is quite expensive. And Babylon may struggle with this a little bit. You're going to have invested a lot in these astronomy houses to get your science output. And it can take a while to actually build these units because you might lack a little bit of production. That's not always the case, but this kind of plays into the idea that Babylon needs a little bit of time isolated from everyone else to get rolling so they can get their production base and their astronomy houses and take advantage of all the things that their culture has to offer. Because if you get rushed early, you're not going to have time to build this. The production cost is too expensive. You're going to be waiting several turns in order to get one of these out. You're going to be better off building like warriors and archers because they're so much less expensive to produce. But it does have the advantage that it scales fairly well into the next era because it kind of helps counter a lot of the most dangerous units like the Samnahaya, the War Elephants, as well as the Hunnic Hordes because it's getting the anti-cavalry bonus against all of those. It's also quite efficient at defending because it has a high base combat strength of 22 and that +3 when it's standing on a friendly district. So the Babylonians, once they have the core production to make several of these units and some population growth, then they are very dangerous defenders, and they can even take this on the offense because of its really high base combat strength. But because there's so much other stuff you need to get rolling as Babylon, particularly the astronomy houses, it's going to take a while for you to get these guys online because of the really high production cost. But still a good unit. So where does this put Babylon? I think for me, it puts Babylon in B. So exploiting food and science is pretty good in the early game. And that extra food and science from the astronomy house really adds up. You can have a really strong science output in your capital city just by getting more science quarters later and getting a lot of researchers without really having to make too much investment in, say, like another science culture later down the line. You can feel free to pick up other cultures rather than having to stack on science because your science output will be pretty reasonable for a fair portion of the game. But I think where Babylon is kept from A tier is that they need time to build. And they're really susceptible to being rushed because their ancient era unit takes so long to build, and Babylon really wants to be focused on doing other things other than just getting a ton of production. So it means that there are a lot of other cultures that can take advantage of them very early before they have the chance to get their emblematic unit out or have the chance to get a good production and population base. So Babylon is great when you're isolated, but if you're nearby someone, I would reconsider my strategy as Babylon. They can adjust on the fly, right? You can still build Maker's Quarters as Babylon and get your production online and get your units out. But unlike with other cultures, the longer you delay your sort of emblematic quarter, the harder it's going to hurt you. It's going to take even longer and longer and longer to really get online. Whereas people like the Egyptians or the Nubians or whatever, they can just build their emblematic quarter first thing regardless of situation. Whereas the Babylonians, if you're like next to the Myceneans or something, you're probably going to be delaying getting your astronomy house in order to defend yourself. So Babylonians land in the B tier for me. Next we have the Egyptians, and the Egyptians get +1 industry on tile producing industry, and they modify the district industry cost by -10%. So +1 industry on tile producing industry is amazing. At the start of the game, this can increase your production by like 30 or 40%, and you get reduced industry costs on districts. And when it says on tile, that means on both districts that are providing industry as well as on exploitations. So every time you put a Maker's Quarter down or you put your emblematic quarter down that also exploits industry, you're getting even more industry from the exploitations. So the Egyptians are extremely, extremely effective at getting early industry rolling. And this legacy trait by itself is honestly good enough to land the Egyptians in like B tier because the industry allows you to get going so much faster. You get your first quarters faster, you get your first units faster, you get everything faster. And on top of this, the Egyptians become much less reliant on population for their early game, so it allows them to settle in locations that may not be as viable for other people. So you can take like those weird desert tiles that give a ton of production and hardly any food, and get stuff online very quickly, and then you just build like a couple agriculture quarters because you have the production to do that to help get your pops online later, because you really only need like a couple researchers. Whereas other cultures are going to need workers to help supplement their industry for a fairly substantial portion of the ancient era. So Egyptian legacy trait, very good. It's going to apply to all the cities that you get throughout the game. It's going to massively increase the amount of industry you have, particularly if you're being efficient with how you're building your makers' quarters to snake around and grab exploitations. So great legacy trait. It helps you right out of the gate. Next are the Egyptian pyramids, which are a marginally better maker's quarter, basically. So it gives you some base industry. It gives you +1 influence, which is nice. You'll have a couple of these in your game, most likely. You know, it's going to help you get an extra outpost or two, or make an attachment, or get an extra civic, or whatever. +1 influence, it's nice to have. It's not amazing, but influence in the early game is helpful regardless of the form that it takes. It only gets +3 industry. It exploits, nearby tiles, but it also gets +3 industry per adjacent maker's quarter. The nice thing about this, though, is that the production cost isn't too high. So it doesn't take very long to build this, and you're probably going to get a couple maker's quarters adjacent to the Egyptian pyramid. You're not going to surround it. That's not efficient because you want to go for the exploitations. But you can be efficient getting a couple adjacent districts to the pyramid, which gives you +6 industry, which is kind of like the equivalent of having one additional maker's quarter. So the Egyptian pyramid is probably the weakest part of the Egyptians overall, but it's not bad. So the emblematic unit for the Egyptians is the Markabata. The Markabata is this ranged chariot unit, so it does come at a bit of an awkward technology. It has move and fire, so it can move, shoot, and then use its full movement again. It only requires 1 horse, but it has this awesome 24 combat strength and 3 range, just, equivalent to an archer in terms of range. It does cost 180 production, which is pretty sizable, but the Egyptians also have the production to support it. Flat out, the Markabata is the best emblematic unit of the ancient era. The ability to move and fire and its absurdly high combat strength make it extremely combat effective. And it replaces the chariot, which isn't a unit you're going to use anyway. But something really important about the Markabata is that it doesn't replace archers. So you still have access to archers. And once you unlock the Markabata, you can upgrade your archers into the Markabata. So you can have access to these units literally from the turn that they're available. And honestly, the Markabata is so good that it actually makes the technology worth going for, even at the expense of some of the other technologies. With 24 combat strength and the ability to move and fire, you can get into high ground or other positions very easily. You can sort of move up and make sure your Markabatas have line of sight and then move back again after shooting. And they're able to move around the strategic map very quickly. They're very difficult to catch. They're basically like having a Hunnic horde in the ancient era that also has more range. And honestly, the Markabatas are so strong that they're still perfectly viable going into the classical era. They only have 1 less combat strength base than a swordsman does. So the Markabata is something that once you pick in the ancient era, you are also going to continue to use it into the next era. And they don't become obsolete until you get to crossbows. So not only are you helping yourself in the ancient era with a single unit, you're also helping yourself in the next era. And the reason it's so good in the classical era is that there's no generic ranged unit in the classical. And the Markabata has comparable strength to some of the units in the classical era. And even though it has less than some of the emblematic units there, because it's a ranged unit and because of its ability to move and be very combat effective, it is still going to be relevant. you are going to have a lot of these in your army if you pick the Egyptians in the ancient era, even once you pick, some other culture in the classical. Marcobatas are so good, the best unit of the ancient era, without a doubt. They're so good that you will get the technology for the Egyptians, even if you wouldn't get it with most of the other cultures. You'll prioritize getting the Markabata, and it enables you to really be very combat effective against opponents in the ancient era in particular. And, you can kind of pursue a bit of a rush strategy if you have some decent population and tech output. But also, because it's a ranged unit, you become way more effective at sieges, too. The Markabata can really plink down levies, it can plink down other defending units very well because of its high strength. It's more than enough to overcome any disadvantage that you have from shooting into fortifications. So, Markabata, great offensively, defensively, great into the next era, the best unit of the era by a long shot. So where's this put the Egyptians? I put the Egyptians in the S tier, and this largely comes from the strength of the +1 industry on tile, which really dramatically increases your industry output, as well as just how damn strong the Markabata is. You'll be using the Markabata for a really substantial portion of the game, and the +1 industry on the tiles just like your output in terms of industry is going to be totally unrivaled for a fair portion of the game. And the earlier you have industry, the earlier you can start snowballing. You can get more industry, you can get more food, you can get more science, you can get more units, whatever it is. The Egyptians can do all those things. So it makes them very versatile. You can kind of pick them whenever and be effective. And I can't emphasize enough how important having extra production from the very start of the game is. Like, you can get out a quarter in like 2 or 3 turns, where other cultures are going to take like 7 turns to get their first district online. So the Egyptians are so good at getting an early advantage over other cultures, and they're so good at transitioning into the next era because of all the bonuses that they get, that the Egyptians couldn't really be anything but S tier for me. So next we have the Harappans, and the Harappans have +1 food on tile producing food and +1 food on river. Yes, these do stack, so effectively on rivers you are getting +2 food. So the Harappans find themselves in a somewhat similar position to the Egyptians, where you place down your outpost, ideally on a river, and you're going to have a lot more food to sustain a fairly high rate of growth. And you'll find with the Harappans, you can sustain a pretty sizable population even without building any agriculture quarters or anything. And that's important in the ancient era because workers are actually very important to add to your industry output, but researchers are also critical because of how few other options you have to generate research other than having researchers. So really the primary way to generate research in the ancient era is by having a high number of population, and the Harappans really excel at that. But population is also quite versatile, so the Harappans can move it onto production, they can move it onto food, they can move it onto money or science, whatever it is. They're able to move around their population to suit their needs as the game progresses. So if you want to hit a certain technology breakpoint, you move all your population onto science, and then you can switch them all back to production once you really want to ramp up, building whatever it is that you're building. Now, food and population are not like the most efficient things ever, but the Harappans, with this legacy trait, as well as with their canal network that we'll talk about in a minute, are able to generate such a substantial amount of food that they're able to get their agrarian era stars fairly easily. But also, you can fill out most of the jobs in your city in the early game and generate a fairly substantial number of outputs with those, and keep your population growing as you're building stuff. I kind of think of population growth as like a separate build queue from my actual build queue. You're building a population, so to speak, and the more you can keep those two going at all times, the more efficient you're being. And the Harappans really excel at being able to continue to grow without having to devote a substantial amount of production to doing so. And part of the reason for that is because of the canal network. So the canal network provides a base of +3 food, gives extra food per adjacent farmer's quarter. It acts as a farmer's quarter and exploits food around it. But it's also considered a river, which means that the infrastructure that affect river also affects your canal network. So ideally, don't put your canal network on a river, otherwise you're losing some of the benefit of it. You want to put it on a tile that is not a river. So the canal network is actually quite efficient because of sort of the base food it provides. It makes adjacent farmers' quarters more efficient, and with the legacy traits and extra infrastructure that you're going to get throughout the game, the canal network provides a pretty sizable amount of food. It'll help you support an extra couple population in your city. So if you have 2 attached territories plus your main city, with 3 of these, you'll support like 5 or 6 additional population. And the canal network isn't outrageously expensive to build either. Now, the Harappans don't have any benefits directly to production, but because they're going to have so much food off the bat, you can get a few workers very quickly, which can help make up for lack of high production by putting those population into workers and getting that 6 production per worker. So you have a little bit more versatility to build stuff other than just like a maker's quarter right at the start of the game, because having those extra pops gives you the production that you need, at least for your first few quarters. Now, that doesn't mean totally ignore maker's quarters, because you still need those production, and you still need slots for your population to fill, but it isn't vital to build it at the start of the game like it is with a lot of other cultures. And the canal network, with the legacy trait of the Harappans, really makes growth a lot more viable because of the number of pops that you can support. So let's talk about the runner. So runner is a scout upgrade, which can make you roll your eyes. Like, it's a scout upgrade, who cares? It has Pathfinder, so it ignores movement penalties from forests. It has 5 movement, and it has 1 extra combat strength over scouts. So really, what makes the runner good is that when you upgrade from the Neolithic to the Ancients, all of your tribesmen become runners rather than scouts. And runners are just a slight upgrade over scouts. So this makes them good at a couple things. First is that the Harappans are actually really effective at scout rushing because of the combat strength of their runner. You can go up an era if you have like a lot of tribesmen. You have a lot of these runners. You send them out, you attack other people's cities and take them over very early. Like when they still have 1 pop, so they only have 1 levy defending. It can be a very effective strategy if you've spawned relatively close to other players. They're also a bit more effective at scouting. So you can find better spots for outposts, get a handle on where the luxury resources are, as well as get more access to the curiosities, which means more science, more gold, more influence. They're not the best unit. They do get outscaled pretty quickly. You'd be surprised how much that +1 combat strength actually helps when you're using them to defend. They can be a pretty effective deterrent when you mix them in with levies if you need to defend your city very early from enemy aggression. But the runners do become obsolete quite quickly. You will keep a couple of them around to continue scouting and to continue to find curiosities. They're not the best unit. They're okay. In some situations, they are like the best unit in the game, just because of your ability to run in and attack enemy cities while they're still very, very vulnerable. That'll only happen every once in a while. So where do I put the Harappans? I actually put the Harappans in the S tier. I don't think the case for them is as convincing as the Egyptians. However, they generate so much food that you pretty much don't have to worry about picking an agrarian culture again for the rest of the game. They make building agriculture quarters actually efficient. Every agriculture quarter you build is going to be able to support more population. And more population means more outputs. And particularly in the early game, that's important for science. And it can supplement your gold and your production income. So the Harappans have this ability to pivot to a bunch of different things that other cultures don't necessarily have by the nature of having so much more population. And particularly for researchers, that become much more effective as the game goes on, and to a lesser extent, merchants as well. It means you can support having a large variety of outputs in order to get your Fame Era stars. And of course, the Harappans are probably never going to worry about running out of population to support their armies either. So the Harappans, I would say it's a lower S tier than the Egyptians and one other culture I'm going to talk about. But for me, they still land solidly in S. And I also don't think you can discount that the AI, for some reason, just go absolutely nuts with agrarian cultures, and denying them the Harappans really slows them down. Like, you'll notice whoever picks the Harappans almost always is number one in their era stars. So by denying that pick, you're really slowing down the AI as well. So one thing to keep in mind. Of course, the Harappans are like always gone by the time you go into Ancient, but when you can get them and you have a river, or even if you don't, they're still a very good pick. So Harappans are S tier for me. Okay, next are the Hittites. The Hittites start out kind of decently. They just get a flat +1 combat strength on all their units. So this makes all their units just a little bit more effective. It's not quite enough to overcome the Humankind difficulty modifier, but with smart play, the Hittites have a much easier time of overcoming enemy armies than an equivalent army from some other culture. +1 combat strength is a nice legacy trait. It scales well throughout the game. So think about when you have 4 units in an army, and that's the entire battle, right? You're effectively getting +4 combat strength. And the way combat strength works is, because it's relative rather than absolute, it doesn't matter if you have 91 versus 90 combat strength or 21 versus 20 combat strength. And as you get later into the game, when you have these massive armies, say you have 20 units against 20 units, you're effectively getting +20 combat strength over your opponents through this legacy trait. Now, it's not quite as good as it was, because there are other ways to get combat strength relatively easily now, particularly from the homeland axis on the ideologies, gives extra combat strength for every step. But still, +1 combat strength flat, every situation, it doesn't matter when, is a nice bonus to have. Unfortunately, the Hittites fall apart on everything but that. The first is the Awari, and the Awari is basically an outpost upgrade that allows adjacent cities to spawn units at it like it's a garrison. The idea here is that it allows you to rush down a neighbor, right, without having to invest production in like a garrison or something like that. So ideally what you'd have is the Hittites, you have your city, and then you have like a series of outposts, and you connect a couple of them and use the farthest one that's closest to your enemy as your unit spawn, so you can get out a rush really effectively. There are, some limited situations in which this is applicable. It's actually better when your enemy is really close, so you don't have to attach any outposts. The Hittites struggle with this, though, because they don't have any benefits to anything that they need to rush effectively. They don't have extra food output to sustain population that you need for armies. They don't have any extra production to make anything faster. They don't have any extra influence to claim outposts, to attach territories, anything like that. So the Hittites kind of play into the style where, you want to rush very early, but you're not actually given the tools to support that. So the Awari doesn't give you any benefit other than just being a spawn point. So you still need your city to build up. You still need production. You still need food. So that takes time away from your potential rush. And you don't have any extra influence output either. So you still need to go out and claim your outposts, probably very slowly. And it's very unlikely that your opponent is literally one territory away from you. So the Awari, at the end of the day, because the Hittites don't have any tools to support a fast, effective rush, this sort of outpost upgrade becomes totally useless, because you still need to build up your core infrastructure to support getting your military efficiently. But by the time you do that, other cultures are ahead of you because they have those core outputs that are produced much more effectively than you. So think about the Egyptians. They build their Egyptian pyramid, they get extra influence, they get extra industry, they're getting industry from their legacy trait. Whereas the Hittites, you can work with what you have at the start, but it's going to take you several turns to build your military units. By the time you have those military units built, The Egyptians can have just as many military units, but also have districts online. Or the Harappans can have just as many military units, but also have population that are supporting their core outputs. And Hittites don't have that at all. They have nothing. So, you like want to rush for warriors and archers or something, but you don't have extra science output. You don't have extra output to produce those things. So the Hittites just end up in this really tough spot where they want to rush, but don't have the outputs that they need to do it. So let's talk about the gig year, or Jig year, or however you say this thing. It's a chariot replacement, 23 combat strength, 180 production. It's heavy cavalry, so you get +3 when you're charging, basically. And it has the suppression effect, which means that the unit it hits can't move on the next turn and has reduced combat strength, which is pretty nice. It's a good effect. The main issue with this is that you're going to get it really late. Because looking at it, you think, oh, I just need to get to chariot and then I can build this thing. But that's not true, because you need to unlock bronze working as well. You need access to copper in order to build this. So the fact that horse and copper is a requirement isn't really a problem, in that you don't have access to those things. You'll typically have at least one of both. It's that it increases the actual tech requirement that you need, because you need to research the techs that give you access to those resources. And the Hittites don't have any bonuses to getting their research. So really, this unit ends up coming out very late in the ancient era. Whereas the Markabata, right, only requires that one horse. You don't need bronze working. You don't need copper access. So the gig year is just like in this weird spot where it comes so late. And then even once you get it, it's basically countered by spearmen because of the advantage they get against cavalry units that are much easier to build and will come out much earlier. And then this thing doesn't really do anything when you're assaulting cities either, because it's a cavalry unit. And the Hittites really need to be taking a city, because that's all they're good at. All they're good at is attacking people. But this comes late. The Awori doesn't help because you don't have the outputs you need to really support an offensive. Like, the +1 combat strength is decent, and, it boosts the gig year up to 24 combat strength rather than 23. But this thing is really not helping the Hittites' cause at all. The Hittites really needed, like, a cheap, powerful, early unit in, like, the first tier of tech in order to enable their rush. Instead, what they got is, like, this situational heavy cavalry unit that comes late in the era after they've already fallen behind everyone else. So gig year, in a vacuum, it's fine. If you could get it early, it would be good, but it just comes so late that it's difficult to make an impact with this thing, because everyone else is ahead of you on outputs, so they're able to sustain larger armies. They have better technology than you. There are plenty of spearmen on the field, all that kind of stuff. So Hittites overall, I couldn't put them anything or anywhere but the D tier, because what they have just doesn't really work together at all. Like, the +1 combat strength is nice, but it's not really enough to overcome the massive disadvantages that the Hittites have. The Awori is just not enough. It needs to do something else. And the Hittites, like, they don't have the production to support, like, going for basically a turn 1 rush, which is kind of what the Awori is encouraging you to do. So you need to be, like, immediately adjacent to an opponent. You need to have both the production and the food output from the very start of the game that you can support building an army efficiently. Yeah, it's just not very good. And because of all the bonuses that the AI get, they're able to produce a fairly sizable army, even if you're trying to rush them down. And it makes the Hittites' life extremely difficult. So, yeah, they don't have much scaling other than the +1 combat strength is it, which is nice, but everything else about them is so bad and doesn't help them do the things that they need to do that I couldn't justify putting them anywhere other than D tier. So let's talk about the Myceneans. And the Myceneans are like the polar opposite of the Hittites as another militarist. So the Myceneans get a unit industry cost reduction of 20%, and they get +25 experience when they create a unit. So that means in the ancient era, when the Myceneans build a unit, they're going to start at veterancy level 1, which gives them +1 combat strength. So already they're on par with the Hittites, at least in the ancient era, because you're not going to have 3-star veterancy units running around in the ancient, at least not at the very start. But on top of that, they get an industry cost reduction of 20%. So the Myceneans, right out of the gate, they're able to basically get the same benefit that the Hittites get on their units, except you also produce them much more quickly. You get that industry cost reduction, which helps support a rush. And this industry cost reduction is actually quite good. And as you go up in eras, as units get more and more expensive to produce, the industry cost reduction gets more and more relevant because it's discounting a larger amount of industry off the cost to build your units. So both of these are very, very good for a culture that is looking to rush down an opponent, and the rest of the stuff the Myceneans have also helps support that. So the Cyclopean fortress is definitely one of the best emblematic quarters in the ancient. So it is basically a garrison, even though none of the emblematic quarters are technically garrisons. But it does have district fortification. It has +3 industry, +15 stability, +3 combat strength for units in or adjacent to the district. It acts as a maker's quarter. It exploits industry from units around it. It's a land unit spawn. It can be built anywhere, and it increases the movement point cost of tiles within range of 1 for hostile armies. This does so much stuff, and it does literally everything you need as a culture that is a militarist looking to rush down someone else. The biggest benefit of the Cyclopean fortress is that it is a maker's quarter that can be built anywhere, which means regardless of where you've placed your city, you can always put the Cyclopean fortress in the most production efficient spot. The Cyclopean fortress is kind of like having 2 maker's quarters at once with how much production it'll provide you. Because there aren't any, you're going to build it fairly far away in an area where there's a lot of production, and you can easily get like 15 to 18 production from the Cyclopean fortress, which is about as much as you would get from having 2 maker's quarters. But on top of that, it also serves as a land unit spawn, so you can use it to spawn your units closer to your enemy to help rush them down. At the same time, you're getting the industry you need from the Cyclopean fortress, as well as an industry discount from your legacy trait. And you're getting experienced units when you're building them. So the Cyclopean fortress gives the Myceneans literally everything they need. But on top of that, it's also giving them +15 stability. So if you have a few of these in your city, it means you're sitting at high stability for longer, which means your population is providing you with a little bit of extra influence for being at high stability. And it means that you can build up your city to be larger than some of the other cultures, because that extra stability helps you support more districts. So the Cyclopean fortress, by virtue of being able to be put anywhere and exploit industry, instantly becomes one of the best emblematic quarters in the era, if not the best. But we're not even done yet, because the Myceneans also have the Promachoi as their emblematic unit. And the Promachoi, it's a warrior replacement. It has no resource requirements. It's a melee with 21 combat strength, 4 movement, fairly high production cost of 180, particularly compared to the warrior. But it gets champion, which means it has +4 combat strength when attacking during the first round. This thing on the first round of combat is basically a swordsman that you can get from the very first tech in the ancient era. It has no resource requirement. It is expensive to produce and has decent upkeep at 3 rather than 1 for a lot of the other ancient era units. But with the discount that you get from the Myceneans' legacy trait, the Promachoi isn't quite as bad. And because you're getting a fair amount of production from the Cyclopean fortress, you do have the industry to actually support building these things. So because they come so early, before a lot of people are going to have really efficient, high combat strength counters to these, it means that the Myceneans, between this and their Cyclopean fortress and their emblematic trait, it works really well together. They're able to rush nearby players efficiently. And the Promachoi is very dangerous. If you're playing against it, you want to avoid it hitting you as much as possible in the first round of combat. Like, you want to sit back, you want to try to get them into a choke point where only like one can attack, or just like be so far back that they can't get to you. But if you're attacking with this thing, you can go to absolute town. It's much, much easier to take over cities using the Promakoi, particularly if you have some archer support. And because of the legacy trait of the Myceneans, the archers will be a little bit stronger thanks to veterancy, and they take less time to produce. So the Promakoi, great frontline combat unit because of how early you can get it in the game and the extra combat strength that it has over warriors, both as a base as well as on the first round of combat. So overall, Myceneans are S tier. They are just so much more effective than Hittites. Everything that they have works together to accomplish the goal of like taking out another culture early on, and they are very efficient at doing it. But the thing about the Myceneans is also that even if you don't have a directly adjacent neighbor, they're still very effective because the Cyclopean fortress is really damn good. The extra production you're going to get from it, as well as the extra stability, is competitive with, any of the other good emblematic quarters in the era. And it's going to help you get your production up and rolling very early and help you support larger cities relative to some of the other cultures. But also the legacy trait scales decently as well. That unit discount, as well as some extra veterancy when you first produce a unit, is going to stay relevant throughout the entire game. So the Myceneans, if you are playing on a map where people are super far apart, the Myceneans aren't as good. They're still fine. The Cyclopean Fortress in particular is worth picking the Myceneans for alone in certain circumstances. But they really shine when you're a little bit closer together. And you can take advantage of your Cyclopean Fortress and your Promakoi and your Legacy trait to really go hard after someone and have these really massive advantages to getting your military, getting a little bit of extra combat strength, and having your Promakoi just beat down enemy units. So next on the list we have the Nubians. And the Nubians have this pretty simple but quite effective Legacy trait. The Nubians receive +5 money on all resource deposits once you have an extractor on them. So this includes all luxury resources as well as strategic resources like iron and copper and horses and so on and so forth. So the Nubians actually find themselves in the situation where they get this passive money benefit from doing something that you really want to do as any culture anyway. Because the luxury resources are really quite powerful in this game. Almost all of them have an effect that's good during at least some point in the game. And, of course, you want your strategic resources. You need your copper and your iron and all that kind of stuff in order to produce units. And I think there's a perception right now that money is actually really weak, and to a certain extent that's true. But in the Ancient Era, because of this trait, I actually found the Nubians to be the only culture that can consistently get 3 Merchant Era stars. But also because the cost scaling on buyouts and on industry cost hasn't gotten insane yet in the Ancient Era, the Nubians are actually pretty consistently able to buy things out during the era. And by the end of the era, I've found myself able to attain like 300 gold per turn, which is a really nice gold income that early in the game. And, the Morale Pyramids plays into that as well, but the main factor contributing to that is access to luxury resources, and specifically you have access to luxury resources that also boost your gold income. You're even more set than you otherwise would be. But this +5 money, you can easily get like +100 money per turn from this in the Ancient Era, depending on your access to resources. Now, if you don't have access to resources, which does happen sometimes, the Nubians are kind of a crappy pick. A lot of their power comes from their legacy trait, particularly in the early game. Now, as you expand, you get more money as well, because you'll be taking over resources, so there is a little bit of a scaling effect. But really, the main power of this is in the Ancient Era and having early access to those extractors. And the money that you're getting is not going to waste that early in the game, because it's still affordable to buy out districts and buy out units and all that kind of stuff that early. But this money that you'll save is also going to help you upgrade your units in the next era and the eras beyond as well. So the Nubians get a pretty solid money base at the start of the game just by picking the trait. The extractors are something that are available early, and you'll usually have a fairly plentiful number of luxury and strategics in your area. If you only have a couple of them, maybe pick something other than the Nubians, but most of the time you should have resources in sufficient quantities that this legacy trait is going to do you a lot of good. So let's talk about the Moreau Pyramid. And the Moreau Pyramid is really nice because you're basically getting money on top of a Maker's Quarter. So it's helping you get your primary era star while also generating you one of the most important yields in the ancient era, which is industry. So you plop this down, basically instead of a Maker's Quarter. It is a little expensive with 100 production cost, but you are exploiting the industry tiles around it, just like a normal Maker's Quarter, but it also has a little bit of money, and when you put other Maker's Quarters adjacent to it, you generate even more money. So realistically, you're probably going to be getting like +8 from the Moreau Pyramids with a couple adjacent Maker's Quarters, because you want to snake your Maker's Quarters around to grab as many exploitations as possible. But it's not quite as efficient to like fill in all the way around this for +3 money. So you'll probably have 2, maybe 3 Maker's Quarters adjacent, but I think 2 is more realistic. And at 2, you'll be generating +8 money per turn from the Moreau Pyramids, and later in the game you might fill it in for a little bit more. So really what makes the Moreau Pyramid so good is, like I said, is that it generates both industry as well as the primary era star that you need for the Moreau Pyramids by getting gold. And industry is one of the most important yields at the start of the game. The more industry you have, the faster you can get online. And the Nubians, by being able to get progress towards both their main era star as well as industry to continue to produce other stuff, really makes the Nubians and the Moreau Pyramid this really good, solid culture and emblematic quarter. You are usually going to start with most cultures with a Maker's Quarter. And here it's just like, well, now I start with the Moreau Pyramids instead, and it gives me a little bonus on top of that. So the Nubians, by nature of being a gold culture that also helps you get your industry, you don't have to sacrifice any industry to get your gold generation. So the Nubians allow you to do things that you were going to do anyway, but get extra gold on top of it. And the things that you wanted to do anyway were high priority items, which is get your industry online and get access to your resources. So through the nature of that, it makes the Nubians really quite solid, because you don't have to make any sacrifices to get the things that you want. And continuing in that theme are the Taseti archers. They are 90 production, they're a ranged combat unit. They have a base strength of 19 and 3 range, so basically they're like +3 archers. But they also have a trait called Exceptional Accuracy, which says can shoot at a target without having a clear line of sight to it. And this is misleading because an archer can do that too, except it takes a combat strength penalty. Taseti archers do not take a combat strength penalty when they don't have line of sight. And if you know how line of sight works and you've played with enough combat, you know that usually when you're using archers, you are not going to have direct line of sight. And the fact that the Taseti archers have this trait means they never actually lose combat strength when they're shooting someone. You can shoot over mountains, you can shoot over other units, you can shoot over forests, all that kind of stuff without losing any combat strength. So in most situations, what you effectively have are +7 archers when you're talking about shooting someone. And when you put it like that they're +7 archers rather than +3 archers, it makes them seem much more attractive. So you can fill out your lines, like your back lines with these, and they offer much better ranged fire support than a normal archer does because of their exceptional accuracy trait and a little bit of a boost to their combat strength. They're also very affordable to produce. At only 90 production, the Nubians, with a little bit of bonus to their production from the Moreau Pyramids, as well as capability to generate gold, you can both produce and buy these out fairly consistently. It doesn't take too long to do. And the Taseti archers prove to be fairly effective, both defensively as well as offensively. Now, the 19 combat strength, it doesn't scale that well like the Markabata does, but you still do want ranged fire support in the classical era. And the Taseti archer gives you an option for that, because in the classical era, you don't have a generic ranged unit that you can upgrade these into. So having an archer that's more effective will allow you to still make use of your back lines of combat and not just like spam swordsmen. So you can utilize more numbers on the field at once in the classical era as well. The Tasadi Archer is really a great unit. Archers are a unit that you want anyway because of their ability to provide fire support. Tasadi Archers are just a straight up better version of that are going to be doing more damage. They're going to take out more opponents before they're able to do damage. You can put them anywhere on the battlefield, really, other than the front line, and they'll do just as much damage from behind a forest as behind a unit as behind a mountain, wherever it is. So they're very reliable, consistent units. They take very little to actually build and get online. They're like half the production cost of a lot of the other emblematic units of the era. So overall, Tasadi Archers are a really solid all-around unit. And because of how solid all-around all the things the Nubians get are, I'm putting them in the A tier. The Nubians are really consistent, right? The only time you're not going to pick them is if you don't have decent access to resources right away, which does happen every once in a while. But for the most part, you are going to have access to a sufficient number of resources to make use of the legacy trait. The Moreau Pyramid is giving you your primary Aristar yield gold, or money, whatever you want to call it, from the start of the game, while also giving you your most important output overall, regardless of culture, which is industry. Additionally, the Tasadi Archer is this really good archer replacement unit. It's really solid and consistent. There's no reason to not want it over just a regular archer. The production cost is very reasonable. You're able to buy it out because it isn't super expensive and you have plenty of gold income. The Nubians are just kind of good at everything. They give you all the tools in your toolbox that you need in order to have an effective early game. And it's not as good as the Egyptians or the Harappans, right? The legacy trait doesn't scale to the same effects that those two legacy traits do. They don't set you up quite as well for later in the game, right? It's not like you never have to pick another merchant culture to generate gold if you pick the Nubians. But you do have a fair amount of gold to play with in the Ancients, and it carries over into the Classical as well. And because the buyout costs aren't ridiculous in the Ancients, using gold to supplement your production can actually be fairly effective, just because of the amount of gold that the Nubians can generate from access to resources and a little bit extra from the Moreau Pyramids. So the Nubians, really solid all-around culture. They do a lot of things that you need from a culture in the early game, and you can take advantage of everything that they do without really needing to deviate your strategy. You get access to all these things that you're going to want anyway. They're just better versions of it. So you never have to change really your tech path in order to play around the Nubians and get access to some specific thing that you want. And that's an underrated aspect of a culture, not having to change your overarching strategy and just being able to benefit passively from doing things that you were already going to do anyway. So the Nubians, for me, really solid ancient era setup culture, not as good as some of the other ones, where the Egyptians, Harappans, and Myceneans are basically always good. But the Nubians, they're really solid in almost every single situation, exception being lacking access to resources. So let's talk about the Olmecs. So the Olmecs get this trait +1 influence on territory. So next on the list we have the Olmecs. So the Olmecs have this trait +1 influence on territory. This does not matter if the territory is attached. In fact, the outpost doesn't even need to be developed. As soon as you place the outpost down, you are getting +1 influence on the territory that you own. So the Olmecs basically generate more influence the more territory they have, so that you can claim more territory to get more influence, to claim more territory, etc. Pretty simple idea with this. So the Olmecs actually benefit a lot from being really far away from other people, having access to a lot of lands that they can plonk down outposts in so they can generate more influence, so they can go put down more outposts. So this +1 influence, yeah, it's relevant at the start of the game. Every little single bit of influence that you can get in the ancient era is going to be relevant. Now, Where this makes the Olmecs a bad pick is if you are in really close proximity to another player. And sometimes it's not always obvious you're in close proximity to another player when you pick a culture. So you need to consider your map generation settings. If you're playing like 4 continents or something with 30% land, it is very likely you are somewhat close to another player, even if you don't see them by the time you're picking the Olmecs. Now, if you're picking Pangaea with 70 or 80% land, then yeah, the Olmecs, you're very likely to start far away from other players where you can put down a bunch of outposts and get that influence generation up and claim a whole bunch of territory and build a bunch of extractors and all that kind of stuff. I do think this +1 influence is actually a little slow, and because you're an aesthete, your aesthete stars are harder to get than other cultures. And even with the addition of the Olmec heads, which we'll talk about in a little bit, I find that the Olmecs actually struggle to reliably get their aesthete stars beyond like the very first star. Every once in a while you'll get 2, but it's very hard to get all 3 in a fairly reasonable amount of time, which is a fairly big hit to the Olmecs in my opinion, because influence is what they're supposed to be good at, and they don't have a lot of benefits to doing other things. So this +1 influence on territory, it's solid. It's an okay legacy trait to have. It'll help you in the early game. It'll help you get access to resources and claim more territories to set up your cities for later. But it doesn't really scale much later into the game. I mean, you will get some influence from that. It'll help you a little bit generate some of your later aesthete stars, but the scaling on those are kind of wonky anyway. But influence doesn't matter as much past like the classical era. So the scaling on this isn't that great compared to some of the other legacy traits that you get, where things like food and industry and unit discounts and all that continue to be relevant throughout the game. +1 influence on territory is not. And, you know, there are only so many territories in the game, but there are tons of tiles to exploit food and industry from. There's a massive need to produce units. There are a ton of luxury resource extractors that you can continue to get gold from. So this +1 influence on territory, it's decent in the era in which you get it, but it really falls off the edge of a cliff after the end of the Ancients. So let's talk about the Olmec head, which is the emblematic quarter for the Olmecs. The Olmec head has a bit of a problem, in my opinion. So it gives +1 influence, +3 food, and it acts as a farmer's quarter, so it exploits food from nearby tiles. In my opinion, the Olmec head just doesn't give enough influence. So you do get +1 influence per adjacent farmer's quarter. The main issue with this is that growth is not particularly efficient early in the game. You still do need a little bit of food and a little bit of growth at the start in order to support getting some scientists. But food is a less efficient output than just having production. So not only are you sacrificing building a more efficient output in order to get the Olmec head, the benefit for doing that is just +1 influence. So think about something like the Egyptian pyramids, right? Where you're exploiting industry and you're getting +1 influence. Yes, the Olmec head does get additional influence per adjacent farmer's quarter, but you're only stacking on the problem with that, because the Olmecs aren't getting any extra benefits to their food, and agriculture quarters are fairly inefficient until you actually get some infrastructure online. So putting an extra farmer's quarter next to your Olmec head, you'll be getting like another 6 food or something and another +1 influence. So you'll realistically, in most situations, you'll support 1, maybe 2 pops between the Olmec head and a farmer's quarter, which isn't very much. And as a benefit for sacrificing your production to build this thing and build something else, the benefit you're getting is +1 influence or +2 influence if you build another farmer's quarter. It's just not enough influence. Even if you put like multiple of these down and attach territories, you get +3 influence for having 3 of them. I mean, so what? You're supposed to be an aesthete culture that's really good at generating influence. And in my opinion, this could be increased to like +2 or +3 influence base, without any real issue. And particularly given how difficult it is to actually reach the aesthete era stars for the Olmecs, I mean, it's a big issue for them. I don't understand the scaling of the aesthete era stars, because even those that are supposedly aesthetes have trouble of getting those era stars until later in the game. And the Olmecs are one of the casualties of that. So, in my opinion, this is, it's not great. Yes, it's nice that it exploits food, but the influence that it provides just is not enough. Compare it to something like the Astronomy House, where it does take time to scale up, but the +1 food and +1 science that you're getting per researcher on the Astronomy House is actually really good. Researchers are something that you want to have anyway, right? So you put yourself in researchers, and it makes those researchers more efficient, and you have more of them, and it makes your researchers even more efficient. The Olmec heads don't have any sort of scaling like that. They don't really stay relevant later into the game because they provide an absolutely pitiful amount of influence. It's just a farmer's quarter that gets you some extra influence. There's no extra effect beyond that. And I really wish it did, but it doesn't. And it makes the Olmec heads kind of crap. I'd rather have most of the other emblematic quarters in the era other than the Olmec head. So that leaves us with the javelin throwers as the emblematic unit. These are an archer replacement, 90 production. They have 19 base combat strength. The range should actually be 2. It is not 3. Like most ranged combat units, it receives a -8 penalty when defending against melee attacks. It has +4 on forest tiles, which is sometimes relevant, I suppose. And not stated, and the most important aspect of this unit, is that you have to have direct line of sight in order to shoot. And that is a major problem. So archers normally can shoot over terrain. It doesn't matter what it is. They take a combat strength penalty for doing so, but it means that you are always able to use your archers in every single situation. Between the javelin throwers' 2 range and their inability to shoot over friendly units, to shoot over forests, to shoot over mountains, it makes the javelin throwers really ineffective. And I would actually say having the javelin throwers makes the Olmecs worse than if they didn't have an emblematic unit at all. Because when you pick the Olmecs, you no longer have access to archers. And archers are way more combat efficient because you're always able to use them in every single situation. Javelin throwers basically require like the perfect terrain in order to make use of effectively. But you don't get to dictate what the terrain is. You may be able to force your enemy to fight a battle in somewhat unfavorable terrain, but most of the time you can't really make effective use of the javelin throwers because of the requirement that they have direct line of sight. It's a major disadvantage for the javelin throwers, and like I said, I would rather have archers than javelin throwers. So it's just too hard to make use of them, particularly in an era where melee units are quite powerful. And that goes into the classical as well. So if they didn't have like a melee combat penalty or had a reduced melee combat penalty, these would be more effective because you could put these on the front line and throw at your enemies, and when they retaliated, it wouldn't be quite as effective. But the reality is that you basically have to find a position where you are elevated above your allied units and just kind of camp there. But those situations are hard to find. It's hard to force your enemy to fight in those disadvantageous positions. So javelin throwers, they just require too many factors to be right to actually make use of them, and it makes them very hard to use offensively. So on the defense, you can dictate your terrain that you fight on a little bit more, specifically with the way that you place your cities. But when you're attacking, you don't get that same luxury. So it really inhibits your ability to go on the offensive without ranged fire support. So where does this put the Olmecs overall? I put the Olmecs in the C tier. I couldn't justify putting them in the same tier as the Hittites. They are still effective at claiming a lot of territories early in the game and getting access to luxury resources. They don't do it quite as well as the Assyrians, in my opinion, and the Assyrians at least have some options should they encounter an enemy culture fairly early in the game. The Olmecs get a little bit lost if they're hemmed in. there aren't a lot of options for them. They can't really attack anyone effectively because their emblematic unit replacement is worse than the generic unit. So really where they're good is on a map like Pangaea, where they're really far away from people, but I'd rather just pick the Assyrians in those situations. So the Olmecs, they just don't generate enough influence as an aesthete to really be worth it. And all the rest of the stuff that they get is just not very good. The Olmec head doesn't generate enough food or influence. The javelin thrower is a really crappy replacement. I'd rather just have the archer. So some things about the Olmecs are just a straight downgrade. The thing saving them from D tier is really their legacy trait that is going to help you get your outposts and luxury resource access earlier. The Olmec head, yes, it helps a little bit. You'll build it instead of your first agriculture quarter. The benefit isn't that much for doing so, though. So Olmecs C tier, even though I do think you could make an argument that the Olmecs are in the D tier. So Phoenicians, the Phoenicians get +2 money per trader as their legacy trait. This is fine. It's healthier for the game than their previous legacy trait, which was minus 25% on buyout. The main issue I have with this is that traders aren't particularly efficient. This does make them a little more efficient, and does give the Phoenicians an option to generate some money in the ancient era by putting people onto traders. And you might do that instead of putting your population into workers. You might put them into traders to generate some money, but you are sacrificing production to do that. You still do need researchers, obviously. You're probably not going to swap a lot of researchers onto traders because you need that science output. The scaling on this, yeah, it's fine. I mean, you'll have some sort of merchant-focused cities later in the game with a bunch of market quarters, and the traders you have in those cities are going to be a little bit more efficient because of this legacy trait. End of the day, if you have 10 merchants, this is going to get you an extra +20 money per turn, which can add up over the course of the game to be pretty sizable. So at least this does give the Phoenicians options to help generate some of the money Aerostars that they need, and they really need it for reasons that I'm going to talk about with the Haven. So the Haven is the emblematic quarter for the Phoenicians, and it is a harbor replacement. Basically what it does is it exploits tiles like a harbor does, coastal water, except for when you place it down, it gets +2 money per adjacent coastal water as well. So really what you're looking for, like any harbor, is a big area of a lot of coastal water so you can get a ton of food and some money from placing the Haven down. And normally I'm a fan of quarters that do two things, right? So this provides you a pretty sizable amount of growth from being a harbor, and it gives you some money for having adjacent coastal water. So what are my issues with the Haven? First is that it's a harbor, and harbors are the most expensive districts in the game. So the Haven has a really high production cost, which means it takes a long time to actually build. So ideally, with the Haven, what you're actually going to be doing is using influence to purchase it on outposts nearby. But because you need the influence to buy out these Havens, and Phoenicians don't have any benefits to influence generation, it's slowing you down even farther from getting additional outposts and getting your second city online. And you're not buying out as many luxury resource extractors, all that kind of stuff that you need influence for. So you're actually slowing yourself down a little bit in other aspects of your game by buying out the Haven. It's still preferable to do that than to hard build the Haven because of how expensive the Haven is. It is an advantage in some ways to be able to buy it out with influence, but at the same time, as the Phoenicians, you feel like you need to do it, and that you can't really spend your influence on other things. So it slows your expansion down fairly considerably at the start of the game. Now, some of the other issues with the Haven are that it is really reliant on terrain generation. So when you spawn in the game, you need to have a good harbor spot. I found more often than not, my spawns involve coastal areas that are just like one tile thick coastal waters, which is not ideal for harbors. So the Haven, you need to plop it down in a good harbor spot. You need to get lucky with your spawn. And ideally, your spawn point is going to involve multiple territories that are next to each other that have multiple good harbor locations. Because part of the benefit of an emblematic harbor is that you can have more than one harbor per territory. You're normally limited to one. I found that this is very rare in how often it actually happens. And part of the benefit of the Haven, like I said, is being able to get multiple harbors to get that really huge growth. But if you don't have multiple harbor locations, all the Haven does for you over a normal harbor is provide like plus 10 money, which is so little for how much you actually have to sacrifice to get the Haven, because the Haven requires a very specific tech path. And as the Phoenicians, if you want any chance of getting your money era stars, you have to rush down that path. And by rushing down that path, you are foregoing access to a bunch of other things that you need in the ancient era, like units and infrastructure and all that kind of stuff. So you're forced into this really specific tech path in order to get your emblematic quarter online that has really high production costs, so it takes forever to get, that you have to sacrifice influence to build in your sort of outer unattached territories so that you can make more efficient use of it. And you need very specific terrain generation conditions in order to take advantage of it. And then I think to compound the issue is that really, you know, you might think the Haven sets you up for a decent growth game, and it can, but it doesn't do that better than just a harbor. Anyone else can get the growth of a Haven, right? There's no additional benefit to growth from the Haven. Anyone else can take the religious tenet that gives extra food on harbors. Anyone else can take the Carthaginians or the Norsemen if they have other good harbor locations. And because the Phoenicians are really, really slow to get started because of the Haven, it's very likely that other cultures are going to be able to take the Carthaginians or take the Norsemen before you because they're able to reach their era stars much more quickly. So the Haven just finds itself in this really bad position, primarily because of the tech requirements. And because you're not going to be building it until fairly late in the ancient era, the amount of money it actually provides isn't enough to reliably get you your merchant era stars. You're much better off just playing the Nubians if you want money. You only need 2 resources to get the same amount of money on your from extractors as you do from a Haven. Like, it's not even comparable, because luxury resource extractors you get online basically from the moment you get into the ancient era because of where they are in the tech tree. They don't scale in terms of costs. They're something you are going to use your influence to buy out anyway, so you're not really slowing yourself down relative to other cultures. Whereas the Haven is just like this, it just confines you to this very specific path. And the payoff that you actually get for building the Haven, it's not very good. It's just a little bit of extra money kind of late into the ancient era. So the Haven has some major issues. If it didn't have the tech requirements, it would be much better. Or if it generated like way more money than it actually does. But end of the day, it is where it is. There's nothing we can do about it. So I'm hoping it changes in the future. I'm hoping the Phoenicians can have access to the Haven at like an earlier attack or from the moment they enter the ancient era. But barring that, the Haven is pretty bad. So let's talk about the emblematic unit, which is the Bireme. So the Bireme is this sort of exploration unit, really. It has this navigator trait, which means that it isn't just going to be destroyed after one turn in deep water. You can spend a few turns exploring. So the Bireme is another ship that I have, or another thing about the Phoenicians that I have a big issue with. First, it is on a really bad tech that like no one cares about at all. You're normally not going to research that tech. It's not a very good tech to have. It does unlock a infrastructure as well that gives a little bit of extra gold on harbors, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have to double check that. But most of the time, it's a tech that you're totally safe to skip. So as the Phoenicians, if you want access to your unit, you have to go down that tech path in order to get it. And I think the idea with the bireme is that it allows you to go out and explore locations that other people can't because it can cross deep water. The issue with this is that very much like the Haven, it's really dependent on your map generation. So it is possible you can, say, reach another continent, and if you can, you're able to discover trading partners to get you access to luxury resources, or discover areas to settle cities that other people don't know about, that kind of stuff. But when you're playing most of the normal map generation settings, say you're playing like 2 to 4 continents, that kind of thing, the distance between continents is usually enough that the bireme is going to die trying to make it to another continent. This isn't always true, but more often than not it is. So the bireme ends up becoming a risk. It's a unit that you build on the chance that you are able to find another continent and meet some other players and establish trade and all that kind of stuff. And you're not going to know if you're able to do that until you try it, until you send your bireme on a suicide mission to another continent. Now, there are situations where you're like able to see adjacent coastal water, and it's like, oh, there's an island or another continent there, but just a normal ship can do that. They can cross those waters without dying. So, that's not really a point for the bireme either. Now, on top of this, because of how slow the Phoenicians are to get started, and not having a land-based diplomatic unit, it makes the Phoenicians really vulnerable to being rushed by other cultures. They have this slow start. They don't have any advantage in land-based warfare. So if you start by like the Myceneans or an AI Hittites or another player that's looking to be really aggressive and has the capacity to support that, the Phoenicians are really going to struggle being in close proximity to other players. They don't have any advantages to defending themselves. They struggle to get online early, and even once they do, they're kind of slow. And the bireme just doesn't help you defend yourself in most circumstances, and the thing that it's supposed to be good at is still a really big risk, and it's at a really inconvenient tech location. So the bireme overall, I like the idea of it, but in reality, unless you're playing on like 8 continents or something where you're going to be able to find another continent, in most games I find the bireme is too much of a risk to make me actually want to build it. So where's this put the Phoenicians for me? I'm really sorry, Phoenicia fanboys, but the Phoenicians are D tier. The time it takes for the Phoenicians to actually get up and running is really, really long. And you have to follow a really specific tech path in order to do it. And the advantage that you get from following that tech path and pursuing the Haven is like just plus 10 gold over a normal harbor. And there's a reason that most players don't build harbors that early in the game. They're just not that efficient for their production. And it's at an inconvenient tech location when you need other things. But the thing is any other culture can just get a harbor and be just as efficient in terms of food generation. They can take the tenant that gives extra food on coastal waters, all that kind of stuff. There's nothing preventing another culture from doing that. The advantage of the Phoenicians is like plus 10 money on a few harbors that you're going to build in the ancient era. So it might come out to like plus 30 or plus 40 money per turn over the course of the era. And because it takes so long for them to get their havens online because of their production costs and their tech requirements, the Phoenicians actually struggle to get their merchant era stars as well. And it's just so slow to get them started. They just rely on so many ifs that are out of your control, right? If you have this good spawn location with multiple viable harbor locations and a ton of coastal water, and there are continents that you can reach with your bireme even if you don't know it, and there aren't any enemies nearby, and you manage to grab the tenant. There's so many ands that you need to be in place to make effective use of the Phoenicians, that actually fulfilling all these requirements to make the Phoenicians good is really hard to actually make happen. And the situations in which they are a better pick than another culture is basically zero. Like, there are almost no situations I can think of where I'd rather have the Phoenicians over the Nubians or the Harappans or the Egyptians or Babylonians or something like that. Like, every other culture does stuff better than the Phoenicians do what they're supposed to be good at. Because the Haven just takes too long, and the money it generates, it's too little. The legacy trait, yeah, gives you a little bit of flexibility, but +2 gold on an output, +2 money on your traders, that's an output that isn't particularly efficient at the start of the game. And I don't know. I want to like the Phoenicians. I want to like all the things they have going for them because they're in a really unique position. But their uniqueness is kind of their downfall because it requires just too many things to go right to actually be an effective culture. So let's talk about the Zhou. The Zhou are the final culture of the era, and they provide +2 stability on district. So this +2 stability on district, you might think it increases the number of districts you can support by 20%. It's actually 25%, because math is weird like that. You'll have to take my word for it, but you can work it out yourself if you want. So you can support basically 25% larger cities than other cultures that don't have any stability benefits. And part of the benefit of this extra stability on district is that you're able to support high stability for longer, which means you have a better chance of getting good narrative events, which can provide some nice extra outputs and bonuses at the start of the game. And you're going to be able to generate +2 influence per population rather than +1 influence per population for a longer period of time because you're maintaining that high stability. So this +2 stability stays relevant through like the early modern. Once you get access to manufactories, and particularly once you get into the industrial and start getting some other passive bonuses to stability, this doesn't matter as much. But it does stay relevant for a pretty sizable amount of time, from the ancient and at least through the medieval and going into like the early phase of the early modern. This +2 stability is really helpful in supporting larger cities. It also means you don't need as many commons quarters, so the quarters that you do have are more effective in terms of providing you outputs on your cities. So this +2 stability on district, really nice. Has a nice synergy with the tenant that gives you extra stability on river as well, and you don't really have to worry about stability problems for a long time. So +2 stability on district, good start. Not the best legacy trait, but it's pretty decent overall. So let's talk about the Confucian school, which is kind of the heart of the Zhou strategy. And the Confucian school provides +8 stability. So with the legacy trait, you get +10 stability from the Confucian school. You get +1 science as a base and a researcher slot, but most importantly, you get +5 science per adjacent mountain. So the Confucian school is a situational pick. And now that I've seen how maps generate, it is a little less situational than I originally anticipated back in the beta. Having good locations for a Confucian school isn't that uncommon when it comes to map generation. You can pretty consistently find at least 2 adjacent mountains, and fairly frequently 3 or 4. So the Confucian school is something you can fairly reliably make use of and get like +11, +16, +21 science. And because you're the Zhou, you're kind of incentivized to place your outposts in such a way that you're exploiting mountains early in the game, which means you're typically going to have more production than some other cultures. As a result of that, it means that you might have the production to support going for a Confucian school first rather than like a maker's quarter to get your production base online. So you can really accelerate your science output. Now, unlike the Babylonians that take a while to scale up, right? Their astronomy house provides you with benefits to your researchers. And it's a strong benefit, but you have to get the researchers first. You have to grow your cities. The Confucian school provides you a massive amount of science from the moment you build it, assuming you're building it in a proper location. So you can really rush through the tech tree as the Zhou. Now, the disadvantage relative to the Babylonians is that you don't have access to the next era's tech. So you only have ancient era techs to research, and you're going to go through them very quickly. So as the Zhou, you're kind of looking for an early era up into the classical so that you can keep researching techs and keep snowballing your science advantage. Because the Zhou are really a science culture disguised as an aesthete. They don't have any serious advantages to generating their influence stars other than having their high stability to support getting more influence from population. And as a result of that, the Confucian school doesn't generate any influence. There's no influence from the legacy trait. You don't really get your aesthete stars as the Zhou. And that's a fairly serious drawback when you pick them. It's the most fame that you generate from your primary era stars. And as aesthetes, you should be able to, place down more outposts and all that kind of stuff. But the Zhou aren't any more effective at that than any other, non-aesthete culture in the game. So you're making a trade-off when you pick the Zhou. You're saying, I really want this science output and the stability that's going to help my cities be larger over the course of the game. But you are sacrificing early fame and early era star progression by picking the Zhou over some other culture. And sometimes, though, that trade-off is going to be worth it. And when it is worth it, it can be quite good. But first, let's talk about the emblematic unit, which is a chariot replacement. 180 production, 23 combat strength. When you have high stability, which is pretty common, you are going to have an additional +3 combat strength. So you have a base of 26, and when you're charging, you have 29. Now, unlike the Hittites, the Zhou have the ability to research tech really fast, and this does have a resource requirement of 1 copper and 1 horse. But the Zhou are able to get to their emblematic unit way faster than the Hittites can get to theirs, because they can research all the techs they need to support this unit. As a result, the chariot gets onto the field. The Zhou's emblematic chariot unit gets onto the field way earlier than the Gigir or whatever it's called. And it makes it way more effective than the Hittites' equivalent. It does, falter a little bit against spearmen. It can still be fairly effective against them, right? As a base with Mandate of Heaven, if you have that applied, you actually equal spearmen in your combat strength, right? Because spearmen are going to be getting +8 anti-cavalry. So it's an even trade between the Zansh or Zanche, whatever it's called, and spearmen. So it doesn't counter its counter, but it's still combat effective against its counter. So this is a very powerful unit. The biggest disadvantage is that it can't attack cities because it's still a mounted unit. And it does still require some very specific techs to get access to. So it's great in field battles. You'll really be able to destroy enemy units with this. Very dangerous. You don't want to fight field battles against the Zhou because they can get access to these very early with their science output. But it does phase out a little bit come classical era. Quite a few more powerful units come online. So you're probably not going to build it outside of the ancient. It can be effective within a particular window before other players have access to some more powerful units, like the Babylonians with their Sabusa Kesti, or once people era up and get things like Hoplites and Immortals and War Elephants and that kind of stuff. So overall, for me, this places the Zhou in the B tier. I think you could argue for A. The primary thing holding them back from A tier for me is that they don't really get their aesthete era stars, which really slows down their progression a bit. They don't have major benefits to any of their other era stars other than science. So you really want to era up quickly as the Zhou, so you want to be able to have means to generate other era stars, but you don't really have that. And, that lack of fame generation capacity for their primary era star really brings them down, in my opinion. You lose a lot of fame from not having that. But overall, it's still a solid culture. It is a little bit situational, right? You probably want at least a couple territories with a sizable number of mountains to take advantage of the Confucian school. And it does kind of force you to play in a particular way. And if you found outposts in such a way that you are planning on getting the Zhou and you don't get them, then it can hurt your game quite a bit as well. So I think the Zhou more or less end up on par with the Babylonians because the science output they get is pretty much immediate and they can zip through the tech tree, but they lack the advantage of being able to research into the next era, and they lack the advantage of having their science era stars as their primary stars instead being aesthetes. And that really holds them back quite a bit. Now, their emblematic unit can be quite powerful. It still does take a little bit to get online. It has a fairly high production cost. When you get it, you'll have a couple of them, and they can be very effective in field combat, but you're not going to be able to make much use of them in sieges. So overall, Zhou, they've landed in the B tier for me. So that is it. Let me know what you think of the ratings and of the different cultures. Leave your comments down below, all that kind of stuff. I like to read. I'd like to read other people's thoughts on these things. So hopefully this has been helpful for you. Hopefully this has helped you think about some of the different cultures in the ancient era. Thanks for tuning in. The subscriber count here has grown really rapidly in the past few weeks, and I really appreciate all of you joining me on this journey of humankind and, getting to explore all these different culture combinations and all that kind of stuff. So thanks for being a part of the community. Thanks for tuning in to this video. I know it was long, so thanks for getting through it, and I'll see you all next time.